My name is Ahmed, and welcome to Dust and Tribe. Since 2012, the original Muslim adventure community. This is our podcast, a production of the Outlander Media Cooperative. We share reflections here, and we sometimes tell stories, and we invite you to learn more at www.dustandtribe.com. A snake slips into a bird's nest and devours her eggs. Is the snake good or bad? And which one of these appraisals is the ultimate truth? Now, words like good and bad and truth are words that we use without thinking. We're not thinking about these words because we take their meanings for granted. We make assumptions that whatever we understand these words to mean is the accepted and universal standard. The snake's actions are likely motivated by some hardwired survival instinct, probably the same instinct that left the eggs unguarded by the parent bird searching for food. And this melange of overlapping needs creates opportunities, both apparent and obscure. One obvious opportunity is a meal for the snake, and more subtle, perhaps, is the possibility, for example, of Darwin's natural selection at play, favoring the propagation of those birds able to stay their hunger long enough to protect their eggs from starving serpents. Now, how will all of this play out in the long term? That's tough to say, because it turns out that the good, bad, and truth of a thing are slippery considerations at best. This scenario hints at the perils associated with our uncritical usage of these terms. As an example, environmental policies are influenced by the sentimental ascriptions of these value judgments by the voting public, with potentially disastrous results. And that's because our perceptions are too finite to arrive at anything definite. We don't know what's true, and neither do you. Despite this, we still need to find a way to get along in this world and with each other. And maybe we can agree on this as a working definition of what it is to be good. We here at Dust and Tribe are not moral relativists. We are Muslims. It's a belief system that we subscribe to and that requires us to adopt the moral standards of this greatest of faith traditions. That's not always comfortable or intuitive, but it's effectively the price of admission. And we are also the citizens of a pluralistic state. America plays host to people with every conceivable manner of cultural, ethical, and philosophical outlook. And this requires a certain level of diplomacy in navigating the relationships we will inevitably have with people who do not subscribe to Islam as their guiding ethos. So where divergent, we do not see their values as in any way comparable to ours. It wouldn't make sense for us to hold the non-Muslim as morally equivalent to our brothers and sisters in faith. After all, we are Muslims because we believe it to be a better way. Now, we didn't say that it is a better way. We said we believe it to be so, and our diplomacy turns on this. In a heterogeneous, pluralistic society, we must all understand that others do not believe as we do. They are wrong, of course, but that is irrelevant to the question of social cohesion, which is an obvious requirement in any functional society. Others may have a different strategy, but ours is simply to minimize engagement with those who do not believe as we do. And where this is not possible or practical, the move is to avoid areas of potential disagreement. And critical to this approach is maintaining respect and compassionate curiosity. And this is actually much harder to do for those of us convicted in the idea of an ultimate, universal, and objectively verifiable truth. Although believers, and invested ones at that, we don't align with this understanding of things, and we're about to explain why, but first, a caveat. This is the part where we get into some dicey definitions. Everything that follows is obvious, but maybe a bit uncomfortable when articulated, perhaps with great potential for existential confusion. So if you're Muslim and your faith is weak, just tread carefully. We are not capable of objectivity. Every bit of information we receive is filtered through fallible sensory organs and mental processing compromised by, at the very least, trauma, bias, and a fair amount of social pressure. In this brave new world of AI and deep fakes, we are acutely aware of the limitations of vision to relay objective facts, and we mishear things all the time. If you're married, you can ask your spouse for confirmation, and if not, ask your parents. And even in those instances where we somehow receive information uncorrupted, our interpretation will always be highly subjective, deeply influenced by a lifetime of experience and idiosyncratic cognitive patterns. And this is our argument for why science is not nearly the rational standard it is purported to be. As a discipline, it is subject to all of the interpretive errors and factionalizing zealotry of any organized religion. Our inescapable subjectivity is why the greatest religious teachers in our collective human history, whether Moses or Jesus or Muhammad, were summarily rejected by the majority of people at the outset of their respective missions. May the peace and blessings of God be upon them. It did not matter that they came with the truth as deputies of God Most High. Most folks were unconvinced. And the nail in the objectivity coffin, for the Muslim at least, is God's statement in the Quran, "You surely cannot guide whoever you like, O Prophet, but it is God who guides whoever he wills, and he knows best who are fit to be guided." If objectivity existed as a human capacity, truth would be immediately identifiable by one and all, and not subject to the selective guidance of God Most High. Despite this, we still have a ridiculous number of people out there working feverishly to convince others of some truth or another. At best, it's a waste of energy. Worse, it's terribly annoying and very likely responsible for a great many people rejecting a reconsideration of their philosophical and spiritual underpinnings simply because of just how alienating this approach can be. And this is why respect and compassionate curiosity is difficult for the person who refuses to acknowledge the absence of an objective faculty in his fellow man. He becomes frustrated that others do not see the truth as clearly as he does, and he ascribes their inability to some deficiency in their person, and with this characterization immediately leading to a loss of respect. Compassion evaporates in a steam of exasperation, and curiosity, well, it was never there to begin with. And while we don't believe it possible to leverage a non-existent objectivity in the ascertaining of truth, we do believe in the existence of subjective patterns and in the human capacity, just it's really a need, to create meaning out of those patterns. When we read that it is, quote, God who guides whoever he wills, unquote, well, this squares nicely with the patterns that we've personally encountered. Because the majority of the world is not formally Muslim, and so we can appreciate this notion of divine selection as an explanation that gives meaning to the pattern. And there are enough of these correlations between our subjective experiences and Islamic teachings that we have chosen to adopt it as our way of believing, our way of understanding our existence and the world around us. Of course, others have different experiences and they build different patterns, and we respect that. There exists within that obvious reality tremendous opportunity for both compassion and curiosity. Now, as people already committed to a belief system and with a desire to refine ourselves in accordance with the Islamic paradigm, we will understand their process as flawed, but that's not an objective assessment. It's a contractual one, bound as we are by the covenant we have taken as participants in the Muslim polity. In this sense, our ideas of good and bad must be understood as having no universal meaning or even utility. For the Muslim, good and bad are value judgments that don't carry nearly as much practical weight as the categories of permissible, or halal, and forbidden, haram. Pork may taste good, according to some. Wine in moderation may be good for one's health, according to research papers extolling its abundance of antioxidants. And the Muslim may very well agree that these things are good in the specific manners described. But they are still impermissible for him to consume. Were he to prioritize the good flavor of the pork or the good health benefits of the wine, he would be sinful. He would have chosen his subjective appreciation of these benefits, the flavor, the antioxidants, over his professed covenant with God. This covenant positions him as a subordinate to God, but his actions contravene this, giving ascendancy to his personal will over God's law. Now, anyone operating outside the Islamic paradigm or disinclined to appreciate the merits of traditional religion, they would see all of this as quite silly. But for those of us who have opted in, we understand all of this as guidance. And our choice to cling to the moral and ethical framework of Islam obviates the need to wrestle daily with the fluctuating standards of modern life, liberating precious energies that we can invest in our families, our education, and in passion projects that enrich and enliven our communities. So, for this reason, even if the pork and wine are in some sense good, we will still see in our adherence to guidance something that is much, much better. And the inspiration for this extended soliloquy came out of a recent discussion brought to our attention. A young person asked a not so hypothetical question about a man raised a Muslim but clearly making choices inconsistent with his upbringing. If he takes care of his family and is a nice person, treating others with respect and dignity, what sort of God would be upset with him just because he doesn't observe certain religious obligations? Isn't he still a good man? Now, there is some avoidable complexity in this scenario that attempts to blend divergent worldviews into something cohesive, but really succeeds only at confusion. Because, as mentioned, the idea of good is conditioned by a great many things, not the least of which is one's moral, ethical, and, where applicable, religious perspective. Asserting this man's goodness across a chasm of wildly disparate ideas of goodness is presumptuous and shrill, as is the accusatory question pregnant with bias about the nature of God. So we can avoid this by clarifying things. Does the man claim to be Muslim? If so, any notion of good is secondary to the fulfillment of religious obligations voluntarily undertaken. the question of God's nature, that's irrelevant. This is about one man's personal commitment to his elected path. This is about his integrity. To the extent that he chooses to ignore these obligations, well, he is certainly remiss, and other Muslims have a communal obligation to remind him of that. As Muslims ourselves, we are less concerned with him being good or bad, recognizing that we are devoid of the objective capacity to make that determination. So we will leave that judgment to God. If he has left the faith, well, then we simply have no jurisdiction in the matter. We assume our position of respectful distance and compassionate curiosity. And for the uninitiated who happen upon this and have learned about death as the consequence of Islamic apostasy, well, recognize that within the brilliant dynamism of Islamic law, legal penalties exist as options and not mandates, and are, in any case, the purview of formal state-level court proceedings and not individual subjective discretion. And this is why it's not enough to simply be good. Because in order to advance that assertion, one must first clarify the term, the context, and the conditioning realities of pre-existing obligations. Even then, one can only evaluate oneself in accordance with all of this uniquely applicable criteria. Yeah, but don't expect others to agree with you. You can read a transcript of this recording, get on our mailing list, and learn about upcoming events at our website, www.dustandtribe.com. My name is Ahmed, and this is the Dust and Tribe Podcast.